localized flooding. High temperatures through Wednesday about 88 to 90 degrees. Lows at night about 73 to 75. Still quite sticky out.
What I always have, that there is nothing America can't do when we do it together. We just have to remember we are the United States of America. As for the other side of the ticket, we are out now to the Trump campaign for their response. And over the course of the last several weeks, there has been a notable shift in the way that Republicans and the Trump team have responded to the possibility that President Biden could, in fact, come off the ticket. Initially, it was to cast President Biden as the only one, as the inevitable candidate for the Democrats here. But over the course of maybe the last week or so, there has been a notable difference in tone where Republicans are now suggesting that whoever is at the top of the Democratic ticket, they intend to essentially lash the Biden agenda to that person, whether it is Vice President Kamala Harris or whether it is somebody else, in fact. So again, just to reset here for a second, significant news here as President Biden says he will step out of this race. Ali Rafa is live for us at the White House now. Ali, I want to turn to you. She's at Rehoboth because that is where President Biden has been convalescing, recovering from COVID, essentially, Ali.
That's right, Hallie, and this was no doubt the most difficult decision of the president's 5-decade-long political career, and he no doubt had plenty of time to think about it over the past few days as he continued recovering from that COVID-19 diagnosis since Wednesday here at his Rehoboth Beach, Delaware home. And remember, this isn't coming as too much of a shock considering what we knew to be happening privately within Biden's inner circle. We knew that there were more reality-based conversations that the president was having with those closest to him, even with his own family members, according to sources familiar with the Biden family's conversations. They were considering factors like how, if he were to step down, what that replacement would look like, what that process would look like, how he would leave the party and the country in the most stable position as possible, specifically in the party's case, in as best a position as possible to defeat former President Trump in November. But of course, this is coming as somewhat of a shock considering how defiant we have seen the president and his campaign be in recent days. As recently as yesterday, they were talking about fundraisers that the president would continue planning to host at the end of the month. One of them with David Letterman in Massachusetts, another in Chicago around the Democratic National Convention. And of course, the president has said that the only things that would make him reconsider staying in this race would be the Lord Almighty or a medical condition. But again, we know that the conversations he was having in recent days were more reality-based, more around the polling and the evidence showing that he was not able to defeat former President Trump in a head-to-head matchup in November. And as you mentioned, Hallie, the question really now is what happens next? Where does this all go next? Notably absent from this letter from the president announcing he was stepping down from this race is an official full-throated endorsement of his Vice President Kamala Harris. And there is even disagreement within the Democratic Party over whether she would be the best person to replace him at the top of the Democratic ticket. You're seeing some Democrats come out and support her, but also some Democrats come out and support sort of a mini open primary where any Democrat could throw their hat in the ring, a potentially very messy process. And so the president in this letter says he will speak to the nation later this week. Presumably we could hear from him as far as what happens next and who he plans to support in that address that he plans to deliver later this week. But of course, all of this putting more of a spotlight on this already extremely tight timeline that the Democrats have to rally around their replacement, their nominee. We have the delegates planning to vote in a virtual roll call the first week of August. And of course, in mid-August is the Democrats' National Convention. So all of this really putting a spotlight on that tight timeline. And all of this really began with that poor debate performance from President Biden on June 27th against former President Trump. And that's where we saw really the floodgates open with more and more Democratic lawmakers coming out and calling for the president to pass the torch to Vice President Kamala Harris or other Democrats who may be interested in throwing their hat in the ring, Hallie.
The other piece of this, Ali, it wasn't simply elected members of Congress who had been frustrated, more than 30 of them suggesting that President Biden should step aside. They had been concerned about not only the prospects for the White House come November, but also those key down-ballot races, control of the Senate and control of the House. It was also, however, donors, with NBC News reporting concerns that money was beginning to dry up going to the Biden campaign until and unless the president were to take the very step that he has taken now in just the last 10 minutes or so. Talk us through that piece of it, the building pressure on this campaign for the president to do exactly what he is now announcing today that he will do, and that is withdraw from the 2024 ticket.
Yeah, absolutely. And as recently as the last few days, we saw the campaign trying to reassure donors. We saw the campaign ask Vice President Kamala Harris to join a call for donors to try to reassure them that the president is going to stay in this race so they wouldn't back their support. We also know from sources familiar with the Clintons thinking, former President Bill Clinton, as well as former Democratic nominee herself, Hillary Clinton, they were privately supporting the president's decision to stay in this race and even encouraging donors to continue backing him. But you mentioned those down ballot races. We know that the president has had several conversations with prominent Democrats, some of them longtime, decades-long allies of the president, having very blunt conversations, we're told, with the president of how his embattled candidacy, him being at the top of the ticket, would potentially impact those down ballot races. We know Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer was here in Rehoboth Beach meeting face-to-face with the president last weekend. And we're told that that was one of the conversations they had, a very blunt and honest conversations about the risk that having President Biden at the top of the ticket also led to. And you mentioned how voters, this isn't just Democratic lawmakers making this call, voters themselves are expressing their opinion. We saw a protest outside the White House yesterday where self-professed Democrats were calling for the president to pass the torch. Also, we have a new poll today, an ABC Ipsos poll, that is saying that the majority of Democrats, over 60%, are calling for the president to step aside because they want another Democratic nominee at the top of the ticket, Hallie.
One of the big concerns as it relates to the eyes of voters across America for months now has been President Biden's fitness for office, his age. This has been a generational issue, of course, heading into this election now for some time. The question is now, this paves the way for somebody else. Who will that person be? It seems as though much of the thinking, based on our reporting over the last couple of weeks, has been that it is Vice President Kamala Harris's essentially top of the ticket to lose, if you will, because she is the person now who is the VP, the person who will inherit, as we said, that war chest. But obviously, there are significant questions about what this process looks like moving forward. Allie, I'm going to ask you to stand by for just a second. We're fortunate to have our moderator of Meet the Press, Kristen Welker, who is joining us now on the phone. And Kristen, a significant and stunning development here today. Kristen.
This is a very significant development, Hallie. It's one that you and I have been reporting on and we've been bracing for, quite frankly. And apologies, I'm at home, so you may hear a little bit of background noise at home. But we've been bracing for this development, obviously, with growing calls for President Biden to step down in the wake of that disastrous debate performance. But this is still a stunning moment for him to announce officially he's not seeking reelection. While I think a lot of Democrats thought this was coming, the fact that it has now happened is huge. In terms of the reaction, we're just starting to get reaction coming in. But I can tell you that based on my conversations, a number of Democrats have said that this would be a relief if Biden were to drop out. They want to start moving forward. I think the big question, though, Hallie, is what happens next? Will they tap Vice President Kamala Harris? Will he pass the torch to her? Or will there be a mini primary, as some people have called for and said would position Democrats? Look, I think that you and I were covering the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, and what we saw there and what we reported on was this extraordinary show of force, the unity of the Republican Party, and I think that that really added urgency to some of the conversations that were unfolding inside Democratic circles and the realization that something needed to happen quickly if they were going to come back in the polls and really try to be able to overtake former President Trump. Hallie.
Of course, the Democratic National Convention set to begin just 4 weeks from tomorrow with a massive question now about what that convention looks like, who delivers, of course, that critical primetime speech accepting the Democratic nomination for the presidency. Kristen, I have to wonder here, and I know that our teams are still reporting this out, every time we have seen President Biden publicly over the course of the last several weeks, Kristen, he has struck a defiant tone. His campaign, his top leadership has suggested that he and they were frankly dug in, looking at where the polling numbers were, looking at, as they described it, the millions of Americans who chose to elect Joe Biden and who voted for him, of course, in that primary process. Do we have any sense, Kristen, yet of what has changed in the mind of President Biden? I know we have some reporting over the course of the last several days that top Democratic leadership, including former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, top Senate Democrat Chuck Schumer, expressed to the president privately that polling showed he was unlikely to win come November. Might that have had an impact?
I think that was ultimately what compelled President Biden to reach this decision, what had to be an excruciating decision, Hallie, because he was incredibly defiant that he was not going to drop out of the race. But you're absolutely right. The fact that there seemed to be this coordinated effort by Democratic leadership, Nancy Pelosi, Hakeem Jeffries, Chuck Schumer, frankly, former President Obama expressing concerns privately about the state of his candidacy, and all of that pressure, plus the reality check. He was shown really difficult polling nationally in key battleground states that suggested he wouldn't be able to win.
Kristen, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Kristen, but we have some other breaking news here as we're talking about this question of what's next. President Biden is now endorsing his vice president, Kamala Harris, to be the nominee of the Democratic Party this year. I want to read now what the president says himself. In a post on X, formerly known as Twitter, he says he reiterates he's decided not to accept the nomination and to focus his energies on his duties as president for the remainder of his term. He goes on to say that his first decision as the party nominee in 2020 was to pick Kamala Harris as my vice president. He says, and it's been the best decision I've made. Today, he says, I want to offer my full support and endorsement for Kamala to be the nominee of our party this year. He concludes by saying, and again, this is President Biden saying, Democrats, it's time to come together and beat Trump. Let's do this. So, Kristen, we now have our moderator of Meet the Press joining us on the phone. We now have a real answer now to the question that we've had ever since this news broke that President Biden is withdrawing from this race. He is endorsing Kamala Harris to take the top of the ticket. What does the process look like from here? She obviously now would have to suggest or select, I should say, a running mate, Kristen, which is another process that will have to unfold over the course of the next couple of weeks before the Democratic convention.
That's right. And it's our understanding that the vice president had actually started that process, Hallie. And this is not a surprise. Again, this moment is stunning when you take a step back and really think about what is unfolding. And yet, this is where we believed this was heading if and when President Biden did make that ultimate decision to drop out of the race. There was so much pressure on him from within the party to choose Kamala Harris, to endorse Kamala Harris as his vice president, because think about the backlash had he not done this. I think there's also an urgency to have an answer to the question, who will replace him at the top of the ticket, and just a deep concern that if there were to be a so-called mini primary, that would ultimately expend a lot of time, a lot of resources that the party just does not think it has at this point. So again, Hallie, not overwhelmingly surprising that he is endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris. And again, she has started the process of looking for a potential running mate, undoubtedly looking at a number of governors all across this country. But again, just a really stunning moment that the President of the United States has now officially announced he's not seeking re-election and is passing the torch, as those protesters yesterday outside of the White House had urged him to do, to pass the torch. He has now done that, Hallie.
One of the questions, of course, Kristen, is does this put Democrats in a better position against former President Trump, in a relatively equal position as if it were President Biden on the ticket? When you look at some of the polling, there are some surveys, some numbers that suggest that the vice president polls slightly better than President Biden did against former President Trump. But there's some polling that suggests it's fairly even here. So there's a real question mark, of course, moving forward as to what this means politically for Democrats come November, Kristen.
There is a big question mark, but I think you hit the nail on the head. Look, she's competitive with him. And that's what I think President Biden wanted to see before he made that official decision to pass the torch, as it were, to his vice president. He wanted to see that she's competitive, and the polls suggest she is very competitive. And look, I've been talking to Democrats who say this is a moment in which she can be reintroduced to the country, not just on the campaign trail, but also when you think about it, the convention. Hallie, think about the convention that you and I just covered in Milwaukee. All of that attention will now be foisted upon the vice president as she prepares to take the mantle of the Democratic nomination. So I think that is an opportunity, and the Democratic Party believes that is a potential strength and could help them in the polls and with some of those undecided, moderate, independent voters who are going to be so critical in November. And by the way, the Trump campaign has already set its sights on the vice president. They've already started doing their own opposition research to lay out the case against her, Hallie.
Kristen Welker, thank you so much. I'm going to ask you to stay close to your phone for just a second, and I want to remind people what has happened now over the course of the last extraordinary 30 minutes here, with weeks now of pressure growing publicly on President Biden to withdraw from the Democratic ticket, to withdraw from the 2024 race. He is announcing this afternoon that he will, in fact, do so. In a letter that is just out from the president, he begins by talking about the great progress as a nation that he believes the country has made over the last 3.5 years, ticking through accomplishments as he sees it on the economy, on gun safety, on the judiciary, on climate legislation. But then he says, it has been the greatest honor of my life to serve as your president. While it has been my intention to seek re-election, President Biden says, he goes on to write, I believe it is in the best interest of my party and the country for me to stand down and to focus solely on fulfilling my duties as president for the remainder of my term. We do expect to hear from President Biden at some point later this week, publicly on camera, about this significant decision. I want to get to Kelly O'Donnell, who's live for us on the White House North Lawn. And Kelly, remember, President Biden just came down with COVID not too long ago. He has been recovering at his home in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. Perhaps, Kelly, with family members, with the First Lady, people who have enormous influence on his thinking and on his thought process, as we have reported here at NBC News. Talk us through that aspect of it.
Well, based on all of our reporting and our observations over time with covering the president, what we certainly know is that he has a close circle of advisors, some of whom have been with him in Rehoboth Beach during this time of convalescence with COVID, something many Americans have had multiple times and understand what that is like, and family around him, key family members. Among his closest advisors has always been the First Lady, Dr. Jill Biden, his sister, Valerie Biden Owens, and key family members like his son, Hunter Biden. We don't know exactly the timeline of how all of this came together, but we know that clearly the president had wanted to continue. He also was hearing the voices from within his own party. To be the president running for re-election, you are, in fact, the standard bearer of that party. And the bow had been breaking for days, crack by crack, now with roughly 40 elected members of Congress in the Democratic Party urging him to step aside, and looking at the polling, looking at all of the conditions, and trying to take a measure of where do things go next. Also, after the Republican convention has concluded, we've now seen former President Trump and his new running mate, Senator J.D. Vance, out on the campaign trail. It gives a stark picture of one party that was in disagreement internally, divided internally, with what should come next. Should the president continue? If he didn't continue, who would step in? And now we know he's endorsing the vice president. That has been critical for Democratic officials who remind all of us as we're covering this that the base of the voter in the voter constituency in the Democratic Party is certainly black women, and to bypass the vice president would have been untenable for many of them. Progressives had been standing by the president, the Congressional Black Caucus, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. Those core constituencies were with him until he made this decision. And so it is notable that the vice president's team would now be thinking about potential running mates for her. I have been told that that process is now opening up, and there would be kind of a deep bench of Democrats who might serve in that role. One piece at a time. This decision today, announced publicly through his social media, obviously means there is a chance for the president to continue to recover from COVID, and when he addresses the nation, he will want to do that in full voice, feeling better, no longer positive for the virus, all of those kinds of things. We're all in this moment, and it is really extraordinary to have the president not seek re-election after he fought so hard to maintain his position at the top of the ticket, and many next steps that we will be exploring in the days to come before the Democratic convention. One source I talked to said if they were divided going into the convention, it would be a certain doom for the party. This allows some time to begin next steps and to try to get back on the issues that they believe are issues that can support a victory, even though there is turmoil on the ticket itself. So that's where we start off, Hallie, and I'll toss it back to you.
Kelly, thank you. Don't go too far, please. I want to report now from our colleague Mike Memley that a source familiar with the conversation tells us that President Biden did, in fact, speak with Vice President Kamala Harris today ahead of the announcement. I want to go to Yamiche Alcindor, who's been the tip of the spear in reporting on preparations that the vice president's team had been taking behind the scenes. In a way, Yamiche, that left open the possibility that President Biden may not take the move that he ultimately did today. Talk us through it.
That's right. Well, of course, this is huge news, but this is news that the vice president was preparing for. Now, of course, as your vice president, she is someone who had always been ready to take the job as president. But in the last few weeks, sources had told me that she was doing a really sort of distinct balancing act. She was both publicly and privately supporting President Biden while also quietly getting ready herself if she had to be the top of the ticket, which, of course, now with the president endorsing her, of course, her team is going to be hoping that she becomes the top of the ticket. So I've been talking to allies of the vice president who were laying out a path to victory possibly for her because, of course, she's going to now be taking this step where she has to make up, they say, for lost ground here. So looking at what that might look like, they were talking already about making staff changes to the Biden campaign, possibly at the very, very top. They were also talking about sort of what a path to victory could look like for her. For President Biden, he was looking at Minnesota, at Wisconsin, Michigan. She might still be interested in those states, but sources close to her have told me that she's really interested also in looking at the South, African Americans in particular being a key part of the Democratic pace and will be a key part of her because she's going to be, if she is selected as the top of the ticket, of course, this history-making candidate being the first Black woman and the first South Asian American woman to be a major party tickets nominee. So I was told that Georgia and North Carolina were the places that she was going to be looking very closely at. So really what you see here is the vice president in some ways having to step into this role that people close to her had been really preparing for behind the scenes.
Yamiche Alcindor, thank you so much.
I also want to
go ahead, Yamiche, very quickly.
I also want to just point out that there were a lot of people that are really sort of talking about this open process and what that might look like. And from my understanding is that there are going to be a lot of women, especially Black women who are leaders of the Democratic Party, who are going to be saying she cannot be stepped over, that she cannot be put aside, that as the vice president, but also as an African-American woman who has been in and out of the White House and who, of course, speaks directly to the base of the Democratic Party, with Black women being the most loyal voters for Democrats. Yeah. From my understanding, they're going to really be pushing hard. So expect in the next few minutes, next few seconds to hear a lot of Black women in the Democratic Party talking about the fact that she has to be the nominee. Allie.
Yamiche Alcindor, thank you very much. Again, significant news breaking today. President Biden withdrawing from the 2024 race, stepping off of the ticket, and endorsing his Vice President Kamala Harris, the start of a new moment in this presidential race. That does it for our NBC News special report. We'll see it tonight on Nightly and on NBC News Now.